안녕하십니까. 오랜만에 이렇게 뵙게 돼서 또 반갑습니다. 오늘 아침에는 이 회의는 아주 숏 노티스로 이렇게 시작했습니다만 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 반갑고 고맙습니다. 우리 이 회의는 이제 금년 20년째 됩니다만은 항상 영어로 진행을 합니다만은 저는 오늘 우리 외국에서 오신 분들이 많지 않기 때문에 제가 한국말로 회의를 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 아주 귀한 분, 모시기 힘든 분을 오늘 모셨습니다. 독일의 유명한 경제학자이시고 또 아주 흥미롭게도 독일 통일 후에 그 동독 지역의 아주 중요한, 아주 산업이 중심지고 중요한 주인 작센-안할트주 주의 파이낸스 미니스터를 지나셨어요. 그래서 우리가 독일로부터 여러 가지 좋은 교훈을 많이 얻을 수 있겠습니다만은 특히 통일에 관해서 우리가 독일에 대해서 여러 가지를 많이 배울 수가 있을 거라고 생각하고, 통일이 오늘 내일 곧 되리라는 보장은 없습니다만은 우리는 항상 그 생각을 하고 준비를 할 필요는 있기 때문에 독일로부터 많은 교훈을 얻을 수 있다고 생각을 하기 때문에 오늘 이 모임이 아주 뜻이 있다고 생각합니다. 우리 이 파케 교수는 제가 말씀드린 대로 아주 distinguished economist입니다. 독일의 그 유명한 킬 인스티튜트에서 오래 공부도 하셨고 또 거기서 연구를 하고 또 티칭을 하고 하다가 이제 이 독일의 크리스천 데모크래트 말고 리버럴 파티 자유당의 소속으로 이 작센-안할트 파이낸스 미니스터도 하고 또 거기 의회 의원도 하시고 특히 이분이 오늘 여러분들 아마 궁금한 점이 많으시리라고 봅니다. 그래서 조금 말씀을 하시고 질의응답 시간에 많은 말씀을 하실 겁니다만은 그 독일 통일에 관해서 또 아주 이 인사이트풀한 책을 쓰시고 최근에도 책을 여러 번 쓰셨습니다. 그래서 파워포인트를 가져오셨습니다만은 간단히 하시고 아마 Q&A를 여러분이 궁금해 하시는 것을 많이 엔터테인 해 주실 거로 생각합니다. 그러면은 제가 더 많은 시간 소비하지 않고 여기서 오늘 스피커 파케 교수를 초청을 하겠습니다. Please join me and thank you, Professor.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Saccon, dear ambassadors who are present in this room, I'm extremely honored to address this prominent audience this morning. Professor Saccon hinted at the fact that this lecture came about on very short notice. The occasion arose because in the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, the joint committee, the joint German-Korean committee on questions of unification will hold its third session here in Seoul, starting at 9:30 this morning in the hotel next door. So this is the reason why I'm here. I'm a member of this committee. We meet for the third time. It was established in 2011 to discuss in detail with great intellectual depth all the issues from political, security, economic issues that were involved in the process of German unification, and they may be, which may be relevant for that great time which may come, and I'm sure it will come, that your country will be reunited. Ladies and gentlemen, I take the opportunity to talk about the consequences of German unification this morning, but I will not go into the details. There's simply not enough time to do this. Just to give you a kind of bird's eye view on the consequences of this process, because the consequences are very far-reaching in terms of the change of German society, the German economy, the German position in Europe, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Well, exactly 25 years ago, Western Germany celebrated the 40th anniversary of the currency and economic reforms of 1948, which laid the basis for our economic system, which we like to call in Germany the social market economy, soziale Marktwirtschaft. And at that time, the English weekly, The Economist, published a portrait of that Germany in 1988. And on the front page of The Economist, you could see a middle-aged German person. By attributes, it was pretty clear it was a Bavarian, who looked fairly well-fed. He looked like somebody, the title was Wunderkind at 40. He looked like somebody who might have had a very dynamic youth, but then gradually became a little bit slower to move. And the general picture that was painted by the renowned economist was that Germany actually had lost its dynamism after the German Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, and had become another boring country. So it was not an altogether optimistic picture at the time. That was just 1 year before the Berlin Wall came down. In 2003, a distinguished colleague of mine, Hans Werner Sinn, published a book on Germany in 2003, it's 10 years ago. The title was Ist Deutschland noch zu retten? Can we still rescue Germany? And that was an extremely pessimistic picture of a country completely overloaded with problems of unification, with problems of the welfare state, with problems of industrial adjustment. And it was an extremely pessimistic picture painted for our country, basically saying that we lost all competitive edge that we had before. Now, look another 10 years from that time on, look at The Economist of 2 weeks ago. I have it with me here. This is the German eagle in the German colors. The title of The Economist is The Reluctant Hegemon. So you see the eagle trying to hide himself, but it doesn't quite work, he's too big. So now the picture is one of a country which is has gone through a wholesale adjustment, which has massively improved its competitive position, and which is now, if you like, economically the strongman of Europe, and which ought to take politically more responsibility than it actually does at the moment. Now, from all this you can see that don't worry if there is for a while a bit of pessimism in the country. Things might change, and one should not follow all the fashionable moods of judgment about the state in the country. But of course, the second big message is that after all, there might have been a big change in Germany, and that's exactly what I want to talk about. And the big change is clearly closely connected with what happened in the last 20 years in the course of unification. Now, first, in my talk, I will first give a brief overview of that process of unification and the consequences that it had, the deep consequences. I will second look at the current state in Europe and what role Germany does play in that state and what responsibilities it has. And let me finally, very cautiously, have a side view to Korea. Because I observed for a long time that these two countries, by the coincidence of history, have a lot of parallels. Not only economically, but also, I think, in the kind of psychological, political state in which they find themselves. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a look back at the history of the last 20 years, of the last 2 decades. What happened after 1990, after the November 9th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down? Now, the coming down of the Berlin Wall was by all means a huge victory for freedom. So politically, humanitarian terms, it was a wonderful event. However, it had a kind of side effect economically, which for a while was massively underestimated. I sometimes call it a starting signal for mobility. Because suddenly, young Eastern Germans, well educated, speaking the same language as the Westerners, could easily move from east to west into a country where the highest wages, one of the highest wages were paid in the world. So there was a huge incentive to leave the rundown post-communist capitalist stock, industrial capitalist stock in the East, and look for work in the West. This made massively narrow the room for maneuver of the German government, because you have the choice, if you like, either to let Eastern Germany go down the drain, if you like, and all young, educated people leaving the country, or you had to take some decisive, courageous, irreversible steps that might give a perspective in the eastern part of the country to redevelop. Now, as you all know, we took the second path. What happened? Well, 3 basic strands of policy were followed. First, in June 1990, remember please, already 3 months before political unification, the German currency union, currency and economic and social union, was established. An extremely courageous and expensive step. The second big pillar of German reunification in economic terms was a huge privatization program. A state holding company, the so-called Treuhandanstalt, was founded, gathering together all the roughly 14,000 firms, state-owned, formerly state-owned firms, or parts of firms that were to be privatized in the East. And within the course of 4 years, it was not more, the vast majority of these assets and of these firms were privatized. This was probably the fastest, the quickest, and the most decisive privatization so far in history. The third big pillar of the policy was a massive public aid program to the East, building up the necessary infrastructure, public and private, that was to serve for future growth of the Eastern economy. That was what we, in the narrow sense of the term, call Aufbau Ost, Reconstruction East in Germany, and which was, of course, an extremely expensive program. Now, I don't go into the extremely interesting history of these three strands. This is exactly what we do in the committee, in the Korean-German Consultation Committee in detail. I can only say at this point that this process involved a huge amount of human suffering, because, of course, the restructuring of the completely inefficient post-communist industrial firms involved a huge rise in unemployment, a huge rise in subsidization, temporary subsidization of these firms to regain a competitive position in the world market, and the building of the infrastructure and whatnot you have cost a lot of money, and the integration of the social systems, notably the social security system, also cost a lot of money. If you take the balance, what I did in my book, which was published in 2009, at the end of the day you come up with a cost of German unification in the range of 2,000 billion euro. This is an enormous amount of money. But however, this is, if you like, the fiscal side of it. That which really was discussed for a long time in Germany as a big burden for the country. However, the fiscal side had a counterpart in a change of the German economy as a whole, and I add to this, German society as a whole. Because after a few years it became pretty clear that our economic system, which had been built up in West Germany, the social market economy, had to be adjusted to meet the challenges. The challenges were so huge. They were much larger than what we had ever experienced before, that gradually a path of change set in, which had very profound consequences for the country. Let me briefly summarize the main elements of that change. First, we entered a phase of massive moderation of wage demands. Due to the high unemployment, labor costs were kept down compared to other European countries, and also to the United States and overseas countries. Germany, formerly a very expensive country, became a relatively, not cheap, but still what we call in Germany cost-worthy country. That was a big effort in collective bargaining. That simply the bargaining position of unions in the whole process became so much worse that, given the high unemployment, notably of skilled people, the wage demands remained, after all, very moderate. Second, the structure of our wage determination system, the collective bargaining system, became much more flexible. So there were much more locational elements of flexibility adjusted to the specific circumstances in the respective region. That was to become necessarily so because Eastern Germany had unemployment rates temporarily in the range of 25, in some regions 30%. The third point was, of course, industrial restructuring. At the time of German unification, over the years, German industry faced two major challenges. The one, the normal challenge, if you like, was to become and remain a global player. You know that Germany has many medium-sized companies which have a good place in a competitive place in the world economy. But this place is never safe. So they had to adjust to the new conditions and notably to the competitive pressures from very large developing countries, newly industrializing countries. You have one next door, of course. This is China. So there was, after the last 2 decades, the tremendous rise of China, Indonesia, India. I'm proud to have the ambassador of India this morning with me here at the talk. So suddenly, the competitive pressures in the world economy reached a completely new dimension. It is remarkable that German industry in general adjusted fairly well to this. And in this process, and that's the second point, the specifically German situation helped because for a while at least, we had plenty of skilled labor available due to the reunification and the relatively high unemployment in Eastern Germany. Note, it's never nice to have high unemployment, but it has one important aspect to it. You have many motivated, well-skilled workers who may take jobs once they emerge in a competitive industry. Now, this was industry, the private sector, but also politics reacted. Remember that Hans-Werner Sinn, I mentioned him a few minutes ago, published his extremely pessimistic book about Germany in 2003. Ist Deutschland noch zu retten? Can we still rescue Germany? And right around this time, there were quite a few big steps towards adjusting our welfare state and our regulatory environment in Germany, which had a reputation of being relatively rigid to the new conditions. I mention only a few points. The overhaul of our unemployment support system in 2003 and 4, the famous Hartz IV reform, Hartz IV as we call it in German. I myself was at the time Minister of Finance and was participating in this reform process. There was a large consensus that something had to change in the system. The easing of temporary work, the easing of fixed-term contracts in the labor market, the liberalization of shopping hours. Germany was a country which had a very stiff shopping hours. We had a very bad reputation on this. This has completely changed. And finally, some reforms in the social security system, notably the introduction of the raising of the retirement age, given the new demographic conditions that were to come, to 67 years, and that may not be the end of the story yet. We may in the future take further steps. So if you look over this, on the whole, it looks like an enormous reform package that took a lot of time and took a lot of fierce political debate. That was not a nice time. You know, I remember the discussions very well in the last decade. But if you look at it, it did lead to results. And if I really pin the results down in a very simple picture, it would look like this. You know, the market economy or Western-style capitalism has very different types of characters in different countries. On the one side, you may find capitalism American style, free markets wherever you look, even in the labor market. On the other side, you may have a country, may identify a country like Sweden, market economy, but with a very strong and expensive welfare state. And Germany found itself, traditionally, somewhere between these poles of capitalism. Okay? Somewhere in the middle, maybe. And due to German unification, in many respects, the country shifted a little bit towards the American Anglo-style model. not becoming America. Clearly not. Not in the positive and not in the negative sense. We still don't have the startup culture the Americans have, but we still don't have the wide income distribution, the huge differences between incomes that the Americans have. But we moved a little bit in this direction due to the new gained flexibility. We became a little bit less Swedish, if you like. So that was the consequence in many respects, the long-term consequence of German unification. We kept our identity of the system, notably the strong union influence, the importance, notably, of vocational training, of medium-sized companies, and very important in general, of a strong industry orientation of society. Note, for a long time, Germany was considered like an old dinosaur, with a huge industry and not enough services. It's quite interesting to see that the discussion now internationally has turned upside down. Even the Americans now begin to realize that it is a good idea to have a decent manufacturing sector and not outsource everything to the rest of the world, because it's very hard to keep the research base in the country and do all the production somewhere else. We in Germany and in some other European countries like Switzerland or Austria, we never did this to the same extent that the Americans did, and it now looks as it was the right strategy. Now please, when I say this, that the adjustment happened, and by and large successfully, I do not say that all problems are solved, which arose in terms of unification. In the last 20 years, we could not solve some major issues of German unification. Notably, we still have a substantial difference in labor productivity between the eastern part and the western part of the country. The difference being, however you measure it, in the range of 1/4. So the per capita income is roughly 1/4, 1/3 larger in Western Germany than it is in Eastern Germany. The research and development base of Eastern Germany is still worse than that of Western Germany. The export orientation of industry is in Western Germany still better than in Eastern Germany. But the differences are gradual. They today look more like differences within Western Germany than the fundamental difference between East and West that we faced in the early 90s. Nevertheless, they are scars in the system. These scars remain for a very long time. This is a big lesson of German unification. It's relatively easy to set up a capital stock, to set up an infrastructure in a poor part of the country. It's relatively easy to regain a certain industrial strength and efficiency. But it is much more difficult to get the growth-generating, innovative capacity that is so important in a highly advanced economy like the German one, or for that matter, a highly advanced economy like the South Korean one. If you think about a future unification, to even out this difference between the still developing part of the country and the highly developed part. If you look at the research and development data, you find that Western Germany typically has double the size of personnel in research and development per whatever measurement you use than Eastern Germany. It has the spending on research and development is also in the range of double that of Eastern Germany. So this problem is a long-term challenge that will remain. Now, that's the story of Western Germany in a very, very stylized form of the last 20 years. A huge task, a huge challenge, with a big effort tackled, and at the end having solved a good part of the problems, but not all of them. Okay, and having become a relatively competitive, having regained a relative competitive stance in the world economy. Now I come to that Germany within Europe in the second part of my talk. You know, all of you know that the situation in Europe is a very critical one. I do not want to talk much about the current debt crisis and the euro crisis. I personally think, that's my very offhand judgment, that we have to solve it. There is no alternative than keeping the euro in Europe as it is, because any other path would mean that the great effort of moving Europe towards a liberal continent with free trade, the free movement of capital, and the free movement of labor will be seriously hampered if we are not able to keep the euro. We need appropriate reforms on the level of European coordination in terms of fiscal issues and of a banking union. Fiscal coordination, banking union. But that's a big topic for another talk. What I want to say at this point is, let's assume for the moment that we are in fact able to get over the most dangerous part of that crisis in the next few years. What do we then have in Europe? Well, I think, and I say this clearly with a skeptical note, we have a divided continent economically. We have what I called, we have roughly three parts. We have on the one side what I call the innovative Western center of Europe, with Germany, Austria, Switzerland, maybe Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, all countries which had in prior times crises, but which have very nicely adjusted and have a strong innovative industry. The second big region is the lagging Central and Eastern European countries. Now, if you look at the eastern center of Europe, you find countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even down to Bulgaria, Romania. These countries have done their best in the last 20 years to catch up. And by and large, they have gone quite a few steps to catch up. But there's still a long way to go to reach the levels in terms of productivity of labor and of innovative industrial capacity than the West has reached. And then there is the third group in Europe, which I call the southern countries. Portugal, Spain, Greece, Cyprus even, partly Italy, maybe to some extent even France, who have had a period of growth, some of them, most of them, some even of bubble growth, a growth which went well beyond sustainability for a number of reasons, notably the introduction of the euro, which lowered the real interest rate in the countries and allowed an internal expansion which reduced the competitiveness of the countries in international markets because they became relatively expensive. It's exactly the opposite path that Germany took in these years. And of course, these countries have to boil down their bubble. They have to get back to a sustainable level of cost in the country. And they are in the middle of the process of doing this now. This is, of course, a painful process involving high unemployment, reduction of absorption, reduction of spending, public spending, private spending, and it could not have come worse in the last few years than the concentrated efforts that have to be made. However, I am relatively optimistic that these countries do their homework. I see a lot changes in terms of macroeconomic adjustment going on at the moment. But even if these macroeconomic adjustments are successful, we will still have the big difference in innovative capacity between the different regions. I don't show you numbers here, but I could. On the research and development activity in the innovative industrial core countries in the south and in the east. And there you would again see a huge difference. A difference which you already saw within Germany. I explained it a minute ago. You find it on a vaster scale in Europe. In my view, we therefore need in Europe a common growth policy beside the homework that has to be done within the countries themselves. We need a common effort in Europe towards a growth policy which gradually and in a sustainable fashion raises the growth potential of the periphery countries vis-à-vis the innovative industrial center. So we don't only need fiscal coordination, we don't only need a banking union to avoid the crisis, the type of crisis that we have fallen into, but we also need a growth policy that helps these countries to readjust and to gradually develop an innovative capacity which makes them competitive in the world economy. Because one thing is clear. Nobody is waiting in the world economy for Southern Europe and Eastern Europe to slowly find its place. You know, countries like China, India, Brazil, they are growing fast. And they are finding their place in the world economy, and that's absolutely okay. But in such a world, with free mobility within Europe, the lagging countries within Europe are under pressure from two sides. They are under pressure from the innovative top countries on the one side, and they are under pressure from the newly industrializing countries which take their place in a new international division of labor. So you see, we have a big problem in Europe. And if I may say so, that if I may take a brief political look at the role of Germany in this game. And here we come now really to this picture. We Germans like to hide. Our history is such that we have good reason to be very skeptical about anything like a leadership role in a larger global or European play. But from a certain point on, leadership, some sort of leadership, becomes unavoidable. If you're a big country, if you're highly integrated with the rest of the world, and if you are extremely highly integrated within Europe. Look at any trade numbers within Europe. You find that Germany is the most important trading partner for basically all countries in Europe. If you look at direct investments, you find that most of the direct investment within Europe, in virtually all countries, come from Germany, especially in Eastern Europe. So the role is there. And it looks a little bit like a political situation the Americans faced after World War II. You remember that in the interwar period, America did not want to take a leadership role. It was its tendency was towards isolationism, and that had disastrous consequences on the global scale at the time. After the Second World War, the lesson was learned. America supported the liberalization and growth processes in Europe and other parts of the world, and the results were very positive. So within Europe, Germany, whether it likes it or not, has a fair amount of responsibility of taking this role. And I think the process of unification was really set the economic basis for taking over this role by carrying out the reforms. But of course the political consciousness, the social consciousness in the country lags behind. We have a big discussion on these issues in Germany, and my impression in general is that we still have a long way to go to really to say, okay, this is a constructive leadership role that together with others in a cooperative spirit we have to take and to accept. Now let me at the end of my speech very briefly look at Korea. Now of course I must apologize in the first place. I'm not at all a connoisseur of Korean society and the Korean economy. But I can look at some numbers, and I can look at the general setting Korea is in. And if you look at the ever present prospect of someday a unification of the two Koreas happening, then really there are some parallels to the German case. After all, a unified Korea, if you look at the size of the country, would have roughly 80 million people. This is roughly the size of Germany. And again, if you look at the history of South Korea in the last 40 years, you see in an even more impressive way than you see it in Germany, an extremely dynamic economy which found its place in an open world market with a highly innovative industry. You know, when I 2 years ago came to Seoul for the first time in my life, I was absolutely struck by that city. What I saw is an extremely modern city with in a high-tech country, which is by all standards among the top of the world. Now, such a country will also not hide behind, will not be able to hide behind, you know, it has to take its responsibility in terms of the role it actually plays economically, and the German lesson is certainly that even a huge task of tackling a backward region, of bringing a backward region in a country to a let's say competitive level is manageable. It is manageable, and it must be managed, because there is really no political alternative if the day comes. So I think that in fact the exchange between Germany and Korea, if I may close with this note, is an extremely important one, by the way, for both sides. The historical luck has brought us in Germany the first move, but the world economy and the political situation in the world is so dynamically changing that we should not exclude any possibilities for the future. Please note that for us in Germany and in Europe, it is today something like an established fact that German unification happened. 25 years ago, nobody in Germany, and even less 30 years ago, nobody in Germany, especially not in my generation, nobody thought that this would be possible. And if you see the changes in terms of political weights, in terms of interests that are happening in this extremely dynamic Eastern Asian growth pole in the world, then a lot may happen. So please don't restrict your imagination by looking just at the status quo. And in the last few weeks and months, the status quo was very worrying, as we all know, in this region. But don't restrict your imagination to that. there may be much greater tasks ahead. And I think the German example, in all modesty, shows that even bigger tasks can be reasonably managed. We should have no illusions and not dream of a utopia. Growth is a very long-term process. Catching up, even in the case of dynamic countries, are long-term processes, but they cannot be politically escaped. When the chance is there, it has to be taken. I thank you very much for your attention.
Germany and Europe and Korea. You're absolutely right that not many people saw the forthcoming unification of two Germanys. In fact, Willy Brandt was here in October 1989, and some reporter asked him when two Germanys will get united, and he said, not before two Koreas get united. And also, our mutual friend Fred Buxton had dinner with the Schmidt only 2 weeks before the Berlin Wall fell down, and he asked him, Fred asked him when Germans will get united, and Chancellor Schmidt said, not in my lifetime. So the possibility is there for two Koreas get united. And actually, I had this feeling all along, even in the 90s. That's why we had invited the many Jürgen Donges and the many German friends. And today again, I think we should get prepared for it. The possibility is all there. The probability may not be that high, but you never know what will happen. So we have to learn a great deal from you. And so your presentation was very, very interesting. I'm very sure that it's a very rare opportunity, so many questions and the comments from the floor. Anyone? Yes, Dr. Kim, and yes, please. Okay, and then Dr. Kim first.
Minister Paque, thank you very much for your very excellent and dynamic presentations. I have so many questions, but I confine myself to two, which require a very short response from your part. Of the three pillars you mentioned at the outset, the second one, privatization of East German industries. This must have required a huge amount of infusion of investment. Where did the money came from? And I cannot imagine it came from East Germany. So if it came from the outside, how did the capital infused with the management which was in place, or did you have to bring in the management along with it? So that's the first question. Second question is, you mentioned something very interesting. That is, Germany moved, if anything, toward the US-style capitalism after the unification, which came sort of counterintuitive to my thinking. So my question is that move due to the unification, or was that due to the trend of the time, with or without the unification, that might have happened? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Karl-Heinz Paque, your presentation was very excellent, precise, and giving us very good ideas if we unified. Before going further, I would suggest Mr. Sargon, because sometimes I forget if I mention later. We need German experience very much, unification or economic model. So hope in these occasions, I hope many German excellent, the peoples invited and have more chances. Okay, Mr. Paque, you prepared the currency unification, infrastructure, the building, something like that, after unification, is very good ideas if Korea is unified. But as Mr. Sagong mentioned, Mr. Willy Brandt didn't expect the unification of the West Germany. Here in Korea, there is some sayings. In 5 years, maybe we can see unification of Korea. That is the change of the stance of the China. So, but big difference between Germany and Korea. Willy Brandt prepared 20 years Eastern policy. The both of the West and East Germany communicated each other. But here, completely, the cut between the communication and something like that. So what it means, we didn't prepare examination. Not at all. That is a very dangerous point. And anyway, once we unified, in your opinion, what is the most urgent thing to be prepared by the government and by the general peoples? That is my question. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. These are very deep questions, which I really cannot extensively answer, but I hope we have another opportunity to discuss them. They are fascinating. First of all, when it comes to privatization in the process of German unification and the investment, where did the investment come from? Well, one has to make a distinction in sectoral terms, I think. On the one side, there was industry. Industry needs an enormous amount of capital when you rebuild it. Industry is the problem in the case of unification, because the service sector, many services are relatively easily transformed from a command economy to a market economy. A hairdresser, a craftsman, that's not a big deal to open up a new shop. And therefore, the East Germans typically took over relatively easily the service task. However, to really push an economy back into a global division of labor, you need industry. And there, of course, the direct investment came massively from outside, notably, but not only from Western Germany. We had lots of European investment, we had American investment. In my state, for instance, many big American firms invested. And of course, the process of privatization was accompanied by a massive subsidization, a once-for-all subsidization. A lot of plants were simply not sellable without giving the buyers a perspective for investment. So we had, on the whole, if you look at German privatization, it cost us something like the deficit of the Treuhandanstalt at the end of the day was roughly 200 billion German marks, which is 100 billion euros roughly. This is an enormous amount of money, and it was so the capital value of the Eastern economy was really, if you like, negative in economic terms. So that is something which is the hardest part of unification. This is absolutely clear. Not only economically, by the way, but also psychologically. We had 3 million unemployed industrial workers afterwards. Second, a very deep question you asked. Was it the change of the German economy moving a little bit towards the US model? Was it due to German unification or globalization in general, or the trends, per se? You're right, both. The German unification was important in particular for the liberalization of the labor market. But in terms of the capital market reforms, the opening up, the deregulation of the capital market, I think there was a parallel trend which had much to do with the dominance of Anglo-American capitalism worldwide. So it's a two-tier story. I emphasized one part because I wanted to to put the emphasis on German unification. Anyway, now what is the most important thing to do in the case of a unification for a country like Korea? Well, I think it's roughly the three pillars I mentioned. It's not so easy, I think, to think conceptually of a big alternative. Well, institutionally, of course, things may work differently. Every country has its own idiosyncrasies. So one should never take one model. There's no one size for all. If you look at other Central and Eastern European countries, they chose other models and they worked as well. So it's not that, the German example is the example to follow. But I think the major point is and remains, once you have a hole in the wall so that people can move, that especially the young generation gets a clear perspective. First of all, we take care of rebuilding the infrastructure physically, socially, administratively of the country. So please, it is worthwhile to stay where you are, and not to move to Seoul. The mobility question in Korea, just to say this, would probably even be more dramatic than in Germany. Because a city like Seoul, a huge city, a couple of miles away from the border, is a huge magnet for people to pop in. And you cannot say, once you have a hole in the wall, you cannot just say, well, let's close the hole in the wall again, you stay there, if you don't give a clear-cut perspective. And the perspective is rebuilding the infrastructure, starting a privatization process, and of course, a common currency. Now, last point, with respect to the chances of unification. When you look back at the 1980s, we tend to be proud in Germany that the people in Eastern Germany, you emphasized it yesterday night, were the ones who stood up and said, we want to get rid of the system. But this happened in a specific international environment. The international environment at the time was, in particular, the situation in the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev playing a completely different tune from what former Soviet leaders did. And of course, a very important role in this game in Eastern Asia would be China. China is, of course, one extremely important player, and the policy in China towards North Korea will be a decisive issue. But I'm a humble economist. I'm not entitled to say much about these extremely complicated issues. Last point, communication between East and West Germany. You are right. There were much stronger communication links due to the Protestant Church, to many other organizations in Germany. But nevertheless, don't overestimate them. I had relatives in Eastern Germany. I was a regular guest in Eastern Germany. I knew how the country looked like. And it was a pleasure for me to move to the East after the opening up of the border. But many younger people in Germany did not have any contact. So I realized that the separation is much stricter in Korea, but we should not, with the benefit of hindsight, interpret too much into the links that existed between West and Eastern Germany. They were stronger than in Korea today, but nevertheless, fundamentally, the country was separated even mentally.
Thank you. Ambassador Prakash, and then Professor Kim.
Dr. Paque, thank you for the wonderful perspective that you have given. One, you mentioned that you didn't see the unification coming. So how much notice did Germany actually have of the unification happening? Or did you essentially think your way, find the solutions along the way, that is one. Two, you mentioned the similarities between the Korean situation, or the two Koreas and the Germanies. What are the striking dissimilarities? One, we have already mentioned, we have noted that very little is known about North Korea in a way of speaking. But more than that, what would be the the similarities? And lastly, since this is the third session of your committee, you must also be looking at the costing factor. So is there a kind of I know I can appreciate that nobody can put a cost to it, but what could be the possible cost of unification of the two Koreas, if there is a figure like that you can put to it? Thank you.
Okay. Professor Kim.
I'm Professor Kim. I have two questions. Question one, that is on currency union. Do you have full confidence in currency union? Is it going to be successful? Or is it likely that any member of the currency union be fallen out, as other prominent professors have speculated? And second question is on Korea's unification. Perhaps I like to hear your comment and insight on the leadership role, the shared leadership between China and Japan, and how does Korea enter into? Say if Japan and China are very cooperative, is it help Korea? Two Koreas to be united, or it's not going to be helpful?
Yes, let me first come to the question of the ambassador. You made a very important point. We didn't have a blueprint before. We did most of it along the way. And that was good. I do not think that you can plan everything beforehand. Once the situation emerges, when there is a hole in the wall, then you suddenly, I remember this very well, and all Germans do, what happened in the 2 months after the wall had come down. Suddenly, people went to the street and said, okay, if you politicians are not coming up now with a reasonable perspective, we got to move over. So there was suddenly, you had to be pragmatic. And I think the pragmatism is part of the success story. So I think in Germany it had to be very pragmatic. Korea has, of course, the opportunity to watch and draw some lessons from the German case. But nevertheless, of course, history never repeats itself. Even then, you need to have a wide range of pragmatism along the way. Even if you take the privatization issue, the Treuhandanstalt was founded, but when it was founded, nobody really knew how the privatization process would proceed. It was a day-by-day trial and error process with many errors. This is absolutely natural, but also with pragmatic corrections that were then made. The costs. The costs is, of course, the big issue. But you can make some calculations about the costs, fiscal costs of German unification. However, I would be extremely cautious to draw too much conclusions from that. Because the story I told you a few minutes ago is the story of a country which not only put a lot of money in a huge historical effort, but which in the course of this effort changed. And I think it changed to some extent to the better. And the benefits that come out of this should be put against the cost. Now, this is never done in the public. The public usually looks at the fiscal costs and says, oh God, was this an expensive venture? But nobody says, okay, what is the intricate process by which the country changed to the better, got more flexible labor markets, had a skilled labor available to be reintegrated and to support German industry. These benefits are never mentioned. And in a big econometric exercise someday, they may be introduced, and then you find the costs look not quite so prohibitive anymore. So I would warn against too much cost calculations early on, because this leads to also politically to kind of demotivation. Now, the question that was asked with respect to Korea, the leadership issue. Now, I'm very hesitant to make judgments on this. There are other people who are much more qualified to do so. I do see a major role for China. China's interests will shift, they change. China is now a country highly integrated into the world economy, and for me the question is always, may it not happen that someday for China it's not really very attractive to have in the backyard a country which is so desperately poor and run down. But I think that this is overburdened, of course, by geostrategic questions, notably, I think, the American presence in the region, which is extremely important. But these are exactly the questions we had to put on our table in Germany in the 1980s. And who would have thought beforehand that we find in the so-called 4+2 talks a reasonable solution which fitted to Europe? There may be another solution, geostrategically, militarily, which fits to this region. But once again, I would say I would not constrain my imagination in this respect. The one question about Europe, the European currency union, that's a good question. There are big disputes, you're perfectly right, among us, the economists in Germany. There are highly respected friends of mine who are much more skeptical than I am. I may answer your question the following way. If we had to draw up the currency union once again, it may be a little bit different. But, there's a wonderful saying in Goethe's Faust by Mephisto, who says, Im ersten sind wir frei, im zweiten sind wir Knechte. In the first move, we are free. In the second move, we are slaves. Once an institution is established, it's not so easy to change it anymore. And to say, okay, the Greeks, just to pick one example, they don't match the structural characteristics we need, let's kick them out. And they should go alone. This is an earthquake. An earthquake would be an earthquake with respect to the fundamental spirit of Europe, and I'm absolutely sure that the international capital markets would immediately reassess the prospects of other countries staying in the Eurozone. Why, if Greece is kicked out, why not Portugal? If Portugal, why not Spain? So the high volatility of international capital markets make it extremely difficult to go for these options. And this is exactly the point where I take a very strong position against my colleagues, notably Hans Werner Sinn and others, when you follow the German discussion in particular, who, coming from economic modeling, say the world would be nicer if the Greeks were out. Maybe if we had left them out, it would be better for everybody. But this is not the reality. And we have to face reality and not economic models. We don't look at the textbook, we look at reality.
I was also wondering whether you would like to touch upon the dissimilarities between the situation in the Koreas and
yes.
the Germans.
Yes, well, I think we have touched upon this already. The similarities, I think, are all questions which stem from the mobility issue. I think the fundamental economics of the situation, once it comes, is very similar. The fundamental economics. And this is where the Koreans can learn a lot from looking closely at the German case. However, the fundamental psychology of the situation is different. And this ties to really deep historical questions. Let me say one big point is that Koreans fought a war in the early 50s. Germans never fought a war against each other. This is a deep psychological issue. The second is the traditional links between the two parts of the countries. Germany was, when it was divided, already a highly urbanized industrial country with a lot of mobility going on before, so that everybody had relatives everywhere. In Korea it was different. South Korea was a purely agrarian economy at the time. North Korea was a bit industrial, but not all that much. So there are fundamental dissimilarities, and they tend to go in the direction, I'm afraid to say this, that the Korean case is even more difficult.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have to let the Professor
Yes,
Paque
no
go
problem.
pretty soon, but we have the Dr. Cho.
Thank you. Again, Professor Paque, for such insightful assessment of what happened in Germany over the last 20 years. If you don't mind, I would like to pursue further the question which Mr. Kim asked before about this movement toward a more American type of capitalism after reunification. I think I would imagine there must have been some political resistance from people, especially in East Germany, who had been entrenched to the socialist regime in the past. And how that political resistance, how strong was that political resistance, and how could it be overcome towards more American style of capitalism? And also his first question that you were quite successful in privatizing those 14,000 firms within such a short time period. But you also mentioned most of them were in the negative capital. And what happened after that privatization? Are they still performing well? And wasn't there any resistance from the Eastern people against their companies being taken over by Western or other part of the world people? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a non-economic or less economic issue. The first one is that when North and South Korea be reunified, we have a lot of problems. One problem is that currently there are a lot of military people in the North. The military people, the Labour Party, or the bureaucrats, all of them will be useless in the unified, democratic, capitalistic South Korea. But in a reunified Korea, all of them are Korean people. So we have to accommodate or engage those people. What would you recommend on this issue? This is my first question. And second question is, when Korea be reunified, I suppose most of North Koreans will try to come down to the South. In the reunification of East and West Germany, the per capita GDP of the East was 1/3 of the West, probably. But currently, the per capita GDP of North Korea is less than 120. The South Korean per capita is 2,200. North Korea, less than 1,000. If among the North Korean people, if they can walk on foot, all of them try to go to the South, there will be a huge migration to the South. If more than probably several million people try to come down to South, we cannot bar them come down to South. This will be a huge problem in the political, security, or social issues. So I'd like to ask your opinion. What would you do? What would you recommend to the South Korea on this issue? Thank you.
Well, to start with the last point, this is really one of the absolute core issues. I don't have any advice. I agree with your analysis. I think the gap would be more dramatic in the Korean case than in Germany. There would be huge waves. I only say something. the alternative, once a wall has come down after a long historical period of saying, okay, we now shut the border for a couple of years to avoid this kind of migration, is non-feasible. I think this is, for national reasons, for psychological reasons, for political reasons, impossible. In the case of Germany, it could never have been done. Some people proposed it implicitly, but it was never really a political option. So this is why I so strongly emphasize the kind of climate in which decisions have to be taken. The irreversibility of any decisions, the taking care of the situation, the clear signal of the responsible government of saying, we are now going to build up the north, so you will have in due course a reasonable perspective in this part of the country, so that you do not need to move. I immediately see this is a huge problem when you have this kind of gap, which you have in Korea. I don't have an easy solution, but that's the way it is in such situations. Okay, let me pick up the other questions. First of all, the political resistance against the type of capitalism. This political resistance was, of course, there. And here we come to the generation of, as you said it, useless people in the new system. It is very, I think this is unavoidable, that you have a certain share of the population, the winners of the old system, who become the losers of the new system. And among them, you will have bitterness. This is difficult to avoid. You have a lost generation. And in a sense, we have a lost generation in Eastern Germany. But, this is usually the older generation, which in Germany was very much delivers the support for the old left-wing party of the East, Die Linke, the party of democratic socialism, as it's called. They gather there. But history goes on, time goes on, a new generation grows up, which doesn't have this background anymore. And even the sons of the daughters and the daughters of the old functionaries of the old system, of the bureaucrats, of the military men, they grow into the new order. So I'm not so pessimistic in the longer run, but in the short run you will have this problem and you have to overcome the resistance. That was one of the big, bitter questions in Germany, and I'm afraid, I think that will be one of the bitter questions in any country which reunites. Was the privatization successful in the sense of the final results? Well, this is an empirical question which is still not really properly answered. We work on this in Germany at the moment. But as far as we can see from panel data, from statistics, the firms that have emerged out of the privatization process have at least an equal or even a better record than the firms who did not grow out of privatization or Western firms. So on the whole, it looks as if the structures that have been created by the privatization have become viable parts of a highly competitive economy. But that is a big issue for future economic historical research. Okay, this was roughly the questions. I hope I did not leave one out.
Okay, lastly, the Ambassador Maffei.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express the high appreciation of the Embassy of Germany for the opportunities that you, Ilsagon, provide for German experts to present their views to a broader Korean audience. This is extremely helpful. Thank you very much. Second, it is fascinating indeed to have this perspective of unification from someone who was in the very center of it, in the very center of creating the unified Germany. Now I would want to, and thank you for to you, Mr. Paque, for giving this talk today. Well, I would have two questions. There were two decisions which turned out to be very expensive ones. The first was the decision on the currency union, And the second was perhaps even more expensive and the single most important cost factor, the integration of East Germany into the Western German social system. This was the single most biggest cost factor. That may be very different, turn out to be very different in the case of Korea. Now, were there alternatives discussed to these two decisions, or would you see from today's perspective alternatives to these two decisions? Of course, they are strongly related to the issue of migration, but the question of how could you avoid migration, isn't that also related to the question, what are the opportunities available in North Korea? And after all, where are the natural resources of this country? They are in the north. So after all, would any fast and grand size investment program in the north not be the single most important measure to avoid that people come down south? And what would be the preconditions in order to have a quick launch for such an investment program? Thank you.
Well, these are again very, very fundamental questions. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. I think I have to give the thanks back because I feel very much honored to have two ambassadors here from India and from Germany, and I also appreciate the whole discussion extremely much. Now, the two most expensive items. It's perfectly correct what you say. Our currency union and social union, if you like, what we call social union in Germany. And within the social union, the single most expensive point was old age pensions. Because what was done in Germany was that, very roughly speaking, it's an extremely complicated issue, that people who had worked within socialism, within the old system, on roughly the same qualification level that others had worked in the West, got not quite the same pensions, but not far from it. So you had the pension system being fully burdened with the people who had not paid into the new system. Now this was, of course, a huge burden for the German pension system. And why was it done? The reason is very simple: to pacify the country. Because it would have been a disastrous situation in the German case if a whole generation of people, and not just the old-style bureaucrats and military men, would have not, if we had not honored their genuine effort of doing hard work in a bad system. These people had worked for 40 years. You know, in my family, for instance, the cousin of my mother, she was a medical doctor in Leipzig, running a clinic. She had, worked, I think, even harder than a medical doctor in Cologne. And if she, at the end of her life, at the time of unification, she was retired, got a pension, a miserable pension, which was lower than a person, an unskilled worker in Western Germany. That would have destroyed the whole spirit of unification. So I think this is a matter which was important in Germany. I don't know Korean psychology good enough to judge about this, what would happen in this country. But I think the German case may be a little bit extreme in this respect. But the problem is there once you have a unification, because these are not just abstract people. These are people with a record of their life in a system that most of them didn't want to have. So this is a real big social issue. I think it was, by and large, the right way we did it in Germany for Germany. It's very hard to say in other countries. In details, I might have done it differently. I think one should have financed this by taxes, not by the social security system. Because there in the social security system, suddenly the unskilled worker of Cologne financed the medical doctor in Leipzig, which is not a particularly good idea to do. So one should have done it by tax, but this is more a technical matter, I think, which was later corrected by subsidies of from the general budget into the social security system. But this was certainly not optimal. These are the typical mistakes, trial and error, that were done in the process. Final point. I said a lot of things which which made the Korean case look more difficult than the German one. Let me at least say one which makes it easy. That's the point you're making. The north of this country is the traditionally more industrialized region. It has resources. It has rare earths. It has many things which are important in a fast-growing region in the world. And this region is the growth pole, has been the growth pole of the world for the last 20, 30 years, and it will be so, I guess, my guess is, for the next 20, 30 years. So this was not the case in Europe. Eastern Germany found itself in a Europe which is more or less saturated. And it's much harder to find, to develop an innovative industrial capacity in a market which is saturated than in a market or in an environment which grows fast. And this is why I agree with you. I could imagine that an open North Korea, an open up North Korea, would be a highly interesting place for foreign direct investment and domestic direct investment, and that should be certainly the focus of a unification program. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very optimistic note on the end of your presentation. The events may not allow us to have the luxury of choice, may be forced to do something, and you never know. I don't think there were any single German who imagined that the East German lady will become the Chancellor of the Germany. Chancellor Merkel.
And the President.
And the President.
You have
both
two
of them from
You have two of them.
East Germany. Yeah, so you never know what will happen, so we better get prepared for it. Well, thank you very much sharing your highly insightful views and illuminating the observations, and I hope we will bring you back when we get united and to get your advice.
You're gonna celebrate.
Right. Okay, I have I hope you have a good meeting today, and come back to Seoul more often, and whenever you do, we'll provide you similar forms. Thank you very much, and please join me.